New York City, early 1911. New York City, 1911. The garment industry is the engine of American fashion. Shirtwaists, women's cotton blouses, are the first democratic fashion item in history, worn by working women and society ladies alike. Making them is another matter entirely. In 1911, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was the largest shirtwaist manufacturer in New York City and possibly the country. The factory thrived on the cheap labor of immigrants flooding into New York from Europe. In many cases, people who had fled oppressive nations, carrying tailoring skills passed down through generations. These immigrants were exploited and forced to work long hours for little pay. Some as young as 15, these seamstresses worked 7 days a week, in 13-hour shifts with only a 30-minute lunch break, all for approximately $6 a week. The factory was located on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, built in 1901 and situated on the corner of Washington Place and Green Street in Manhattan's Greenwich Village. The building was advertised as fireproof. Most of its workers were recent Italian or Jewish immigrants, aged 14 to 23. Row after row of sewing machines. Women bent at the waist, shoulders forward, feeding fabric. Bolts of cloth stacked to the ceiling. Scraps of cotton and linen drifting to the floor like snow. At the Triangle factory, women had to leave the building to use the bathroom, so management began locking the steel exit doors to prevent the interruption of work. Only the foreman held the keys. The factory was a true sweatshop, employing young immigrant women who worked in cramped space at lines of sewing machines. In 1911, there were 4 elevators with access to the factory floors, but only 2 were fully operational, and workers had to file down a narrow corridor to reach them. There were 2 stairways to the street. One was locked from the outside to prevent theft, and the other opened inward only. The fire escape was so narrow it would have taken hours for all workers to use it under the best of circumstances. The owners had been warned. The New York Board of Sanitary Control had cited the building for violations. They refused to install sprinklers. They refused to change the doors. In the fall of 1909, as factory owners pressed shirtwaist makers to work longer hours for less money, several hundred workers went on strike. On November 22nd, Local 25 of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union convened a mass meeting. Thousands of workers packed the hall. The next morning, more than 15,000 shirtwaist makers walked out across New York's garment district. They demanded a 20% pay raise, a 52-hour work week, and extra pay for overtime. When picketing began the following day, more than 20,000 workers from 500 factories had walked out. The fiercely anti-union owners of the Triangle factory met with the owners of the 20 largest factories to resist the strike by any means, from hiring thugs to beat up strikers to using political pressure to keep the police on their side. Triangle's owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, did not yield. The doors stayed locked. Saturday, March 25th, 1911, 4:40 p.m. It is payday. 500 workers are collecting their wages and preparing to go home. Then, on the 8th floor, a match touches fabric. In the late afternoon of March 25th, 1911, as factory workers were receiving their paychecks and preparing to go home, a fire broke out on the 8th floor. Within minutes, flames engulfed the upper floors of the factory. A match had come into contact with fabric and debris, and the fire spread rapidly, fed by thousands of pounds of cloth. An 8th floor employee was able to notify the 10th floor by telephone, and the majority of 8th and 10th floor workers escaped. The 300 9th floor employees did not become aware of the fire until it had almost reached them. Around 100 made it down the one open stairway before it became impassable. Bystanders on the street look up. Small figures appear in the windows of the upper floors. 2 high, impossibly high. The New York City Fire Department arrived, but their ladders reached only as high as the 6th floor of the building, 2 entire floors below where the fire burned. Outside, firefighters' ladders were too short to reach the top floors, and ineffective safety nets ripped like paper. Inside, long tables and bulky machines trapped many of the victims. Panicked workers were crushed as they struggled with doors that were locked by managers, or doors that opened inward against the press of bodies. The fire escape was so narrow that it would have taken hours for all the workers to use it. In fact, it collapsed during the fire under the strain of extreme heat and weight as people rushed to get down. The fire lasted 30 minutes. Most on the 8th and 10th floors escaped. However, dozens trapped on the 9th floor died, unable to force open the locked door that would have led to their escape. The fire caused the deaths of 146 garment workers, 123 women and girls, and 23 men, who died from the fire itself, from smoke inhalation, or from falling or jumping to their deaths. Among the dead, women as young as 14, recent brides, daughters who had sent money home to Sicily and Minsk. One victim was Daisy Lopez Fitz, a 22-year-old newlywed who had taken a job at the Triangle factory to save extra money before leaving for Europe to begin a new life with her husband. Saturday, March 25, 1911, was payday. She never returned. Eyewitness William G. Shepard, a United Press reporter on the scene, later wrote that he had learned a new sound, a more horrible sound than description can picture. Max Blank and Isaac Harris sit at the defense table. Their attorney, Max Stoyer, is considered one of the finest trial lawyers in the country. The company's owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, both Jewish immigrants, had survived the fire by fleeing to the building's roof when it began. They were indicted in mid-April on charges of first and second-degree manslaughter. Their trial began on December 4th, 1911. Defense counsel Max Stoyer managed to destroy the credibility of a key survivor, Kate Alterman, by asking her to repeat her testimony multiple times. She did so without altering key phrases, which Stoyer argued to the jury proved she had memorized a coach statement. The prosecution charged that the owners knew the exit doors were locked. The defense stressed that the prosecution failed to prove the owners had personal knowledge of the locked doors at that precise moment. Despite a good deal of evidence that the owners and management had been horribly negligent, the grand jury had indicted them on manslaughter charges, but the prosecution failed to convict them. They were fined $75 for each life lost. However, their insurance policy paid them a total of $60,000 at the rate of $400 per life, so they actually profited from the tragedy. 2 years later, they were again caught locking the doors to factory exits and were fined for safety code violations. The owners walked free, the dead stayed dead. Then the city changed. New York City, April 5th, 1911. A procession moves uptown in silence. No music, empty hearses at the front. Behind them, an ocean of people. On April 6, 30,000 New Yorkers marched, and hundreds of thousands more lined the route, behind empty hearses to memorialize the fire's victims. Numerous rallies, editorials, and public meetings called for legislative action, ranging from fire safety codes to restrictions on child labor. Frances Perkins, secretary of the New York City Committee on Public Safety, had witnessed the Triangle Fire firsthand and was shocked by what she saw. She later recalled, "It was as though we had all done something wrong. It shouldn't have been. We were sorry. Mea culpa. We didn't want it that way. We hadn't intended to have girls and boys killed in a factory." Perkins and the reformers convinced Governor John Dix of the merits of state-level action. He suggested they consult with Assemblyman Alfred Smith and Senate Majority Leader Robert F. Wagner, two Tammany Hall Democrats. The two politicians submitted a resolution to the legislature to fund an investigative commission. On June 30th, 1911, it passed, establishing the Factory Investigating Commission. The commission investigated nearly 2,000 factories in dozens of industries and, with the help of advocates like Francis Perkins, enacted 8 laws covering fire safety, factory inspections, sanitation, and employment rules for women and children. The following year, they pushed for 25 more laws, entirely rewriting New York State's labor code and creating a State Department of Labor to enforce it. New laws mandated better building access and egress, fireproofing requirements, the availability of fire extinguishers, the installation of alarm systems and automatic sprinklers, better eating and toilet facilities for workers, and limitations on the hours women and children could work. From 1911 to 1913, 60 of the 64 new laws recommended by the commission were passed, with the support of Governor William Sulzer. They set maximum numbers of workers per floor. They established codes requiring new buildings to include fireproof stairways and fire escapes. They required employers to provide clean drinking water, washrooms, and toilets for their employees. They ruled that women could work no more than 54 hours a week, and that children under 18 could not work in dangerous occupations. In October 1911, the New York City Board of Aldermen also passed an act creating the Bureau of Fire Prevention, aimed at ending confusion over inspection responsibilities and enforcement powers. The new bureau required fireproof materials, stairwells, fire alarms, extinguishers, and hoses in all factories, and banned smoking on factory floors by 1916. New York became, in the words of the Factory Investigating Commission's own reports, one of the most progressive states in terms of labor reform. Other states followed. The long shadow. From Albany to Washington, the Triangle Fire spurred support for workplace safety and labor rights across the nation. Francis Perkins, a young social worker who had witnessed the fire, later became the first female U.S. Secretary of Labor. As Secretary of Labor under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, she championed the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the federal minimum wage, limited working hours, and outlawed child labor. During the Roosevelt administration, Francis Perkins and Robert Wagner, who had chaired the Factory Investigating Commission, helped create the nation's most sweeping worker protections through the New Deal, including the National Labor Relations Act, which guaranteed workers the right to organize and bargain collectively. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, established in 1970, is also a direct result of the reform movement that followed the Triangle Fire. The building at 23 to 29 Washington Place still stands. It is now part of New York University. A bronze plaque on its facade marks it as a National Historic Landmark. Every year, on March 25th, 146 names are read aloud. The Triangle Fire of March 25th, 1911, destroyed hundreds of lives, both those who died and their families. Sadly, it required the ashes of 146 people to redesign and reimagine the American workplace. It remains one of the most vivid symbols of the American labor movement and a constant reminder that government must ensure a safe workplace. After the fire, their story inspired hundreds of activists across the state and the nation to push for fundamental reforms. It is estimated that more than 100 workers died every day on the job around 1911. The shirtwaist maker's story was so compelling because it brought attention not just to a single fire, but to the events and the choices that made it inevitable. 146 dead, no convictions, 60 new laws, a Department of Labor, a minimum wage, the right to organize, OSHA. All of it began on a Saturday afternoon on the 9th floor behind a locked door.